We are ready to go. It's now 12:34 p.m. and good afternoon. My name is Fred Farias, and I'm the chairman of the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. Before we call this meeting to order, I would like to announce that on October 19, 2021, Governor Greg Abbott appointed Dr. Daniel Wong to the board. I will formally introduce our new board member at tomorrow's board meeting. This time, I would like to pass the gavel to Ms. Emma Schwartz to officially call the meeting of the Agency Operations Committee to order. Ms. Schwartz.
Thank you, and good afternoon. My name is Emma Schwartz, and I'm the chair of the Agency Operations Committee. It is 12:35 p.m., and I'd like to call the January 26th Agency Operations Committee meeting to order. Please be aware that this meeting is being broadcast via the internet. Before we begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome those joining us via video conference and ask that they observe the following etiquette. Please state your name before you speak. Please mute your phone when not speaking and keep background noise to a minimum. Members, when I call your name, please announce present. Welcome Wilson, Vice Chair.
Present.
Javed Anwar. Fred Farias.
Present.
Robert Gaunt.
Present.
Donna Williams.
Present.
Matthew Smith, student member. And myself, Emma Schwartz. Please record in the minutes that we have a quorum. Agenda item 2 is approval of the minutes from the October 20th, 2021 Agency Operations Committee meeting. Do I have a motion for the approval of the minutes?
So moved.
We have a motion.
Second.
And a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed say no. Okay, the motion passes. Agenda item 3 is public testimony, and we do not have anyone registered to testify today, so we'll go on to the next item. Agenda item 4 is approval of the consent calendar. We do not have any items on the consent calendar today, so we'll move on to the next agenda item. Agenda item 5A is a report on grants and contracts. This item does not require any action. Members, these reports were included in the agenda materials that you were provided prior to the meeting. Ms. Linda Natal, Director of Contracts and Procurement, is available if you have any questions. Hi, Ms. Natal. If there are no questions, we'll move on to the next agenda item. That was quick. Thank you. Agenda item 6A is review of the fiscal year 2022 financial report to the board. This item does not require any action. Mr. Ken Martin, Assistant Commissioner for Financial Services and Chief Financial Officer, will present this item to the committee and is available for questions. Mr. Martin.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, members. This item I bring before the board each quarter. As you recall, the October board meeting, I presented the final report, the closeout for the fiscal year 2021. This is the first report for the first quarter of fiscal year 2022 and for the biennium. So there aren't really any major notable activity on this report, but since we did have new board members, I did want to go through the report in a little more detail as far as sections and just give a brief overview of what the report is and what it consists. Next slide, please. This particular slide just is a summary overview of everything combined from our budget, our total budget, either operating or what we call trusteed. Operating is what we'll use as administration, and the trustee will be more programmatic. This one shows you what's available, what we have either expended or encumbered year to date, and this is a culmination of the detail for the next couple slides. Next slide, please. So we receive appropriations in our bill pattern that are broken out into goals, either A, B, C, etc., and then subcategories within those goals that are strategies. And you can see here, these are our specific strategies, A11, A12, etc., B11, and on down. So our agency operations administration is in our A goal, and we were able to consolidate a lot of our operational strategies to make it a little more efficient on utilization of funding. And then you see the programmatic side where we get into our specific programs, our largest being our Texas Grant Program and the B11. Next slide, please. And here it continues on down, as well as community colleges at the very bottom in what we'll call Z11. That's actually not an appropriated strategy, but it is an appropriation in the bill pattern that is separate from the coordinating board. So the coordinating board from the state is Agency 781, but the coordinating board has cognizance over the funding for community colleges, which are Agency 704. The reason we have cognizance over that is because community colleges are not state entities, so funding cannot be appropriated directly to them. It's appropriated to the coordinating board. The coordinating board then distributes in 10 equal payments throughout the year to the community colleges. Next slide, please. We also break out our federal funding, and you've heard the commissioner and other teams discuss our federal funds, or the GEAR funds, as we've talked about. Federal funds are a little unique, whereas the state funding operates on an appropriation year, which is typically the same as the fiscal year, which runs September 1st through August 31st. Federal funds run whatever the period that oversight agency provides. So GEAR funding in our most recent round has till 9/30 of 22, so you can see it does not have perfect alignment with our state appropriations. So we did delineate those separately because if we include them with their state funding, it becomes a little, doesn't present the appropriate picture because it doesn't have that same alignment. Next slide, please. And keep going. And when we create the budgets, we get board approval, typically at the July board meeting, which we did this last July for this biennium, fiscal year 22 and 23. That is our starting point. That's what I'll call our base starting point for our budget. Our policy is that when we have budget adjustments from that point forward, we receive commissioner approval. And you can see here, most of the adjustments that are made within this report are based on what we call UB, and that is where we can take an unexpended balance and carry it forward into the next fiscal year, of which we've done in some of these areas. So there's a lot of adjustments, but the majority of those are UB. But that gives the board, since we do present this each quarter, the board visibility, any adjustments made from the base that they previously approved. Next couple slides, please. More. So going from our programmatic, what's in our appropriation in our bill pattern, to what's appropriated but not necessarily in our bill pattern is our loan program. We've had a few different loan programs in the past, some that are general revenue funded or state funds are in our bill pattern, but our college access loan program is actually funded by the utilization of bonds, which you've heard me before request for board approval on various bond resolutions and various vendors that we use to support this: bond counsel, financial advisor, et cetera. We have two different major funds that we keep our loan program cash in. One is our loan fund account, and we're required by statute when we issue new bonds and we receive the proceeds from the investors to deposit into a specific student loan auxiliary account at the comptroller. And then we have our debt service fund. So statute, Chapter 52 of the Education Code requires us to deposit all repayments, payments coming back from borrowers who are paying on their loans, to go into our debt service fund account. Separate, but somewhat related, is unappropriated cash. So if you recall, those of you who have been here, we had the Be On Time loan program that was initially funded by set-asides that were received from institutions, tuition set-asides, and similar, our physician education loan repayment program. Those set-asides were collected were higher than what eventually was being appropriated for us to expend. And we've collected a balance of approximately $176 million. Approximately $130 to $135 million of that is the remaining funds from the tuition set-aside for the Be On Time loan program. Last session, legislature did not reappropriate those funds for another purpose, so they'll remain in this account. The cash is at the comptroller, but it's still assigned, I won't say appropriated, but assigned to us until legislature determines another purpose. This just gives you some activity on our cumulative total loan programs: college access loan, Be On Time loan program, Texas Armed Services Scholarship loan program, et cetera. And you see in the note below the major loan programs are there. We have a few older programs that are in these totals, but they're very small. Listen, million in each one of those. But you can see the total balance to the far right of what is in our receivables for principal, interest, fees, et cetera. Next slide, please. And here it just shows some trending of our loan and debt service funds, and nothing notable. You can see where sometimes in the blue line or black line you can see the spike. That's typically when we've issued bonds, which is around the July timeframe. So you'll see the cash infusion that we received there, and we make our debt service payments in February 1st and August 1st. So within probably less than a week, we'll be making our first of this fiscal year debt service payment. Next slide, please. And some more trending of cumulative loan disbursement trending to the right in the upper right-hand corner, as well as, again, the loan fund cash balance forecast that we'll have out there for what we'll have this year, and then what we're projecting for next year as well. And then our student loan payment clearing account. We have an account that, as I mentioned, the payments coming in from borrowers go into a specific dedicated account, and then once the payments are applied to the loan, then the funds are transitioned over our debt service account. So this is the clearing account. When those funds come in, we're constantly applying payments, so there's constantly a balance there just because of timing. Next slide, please. We've discussed previously, the Office of Attorney General provides support for the student loan program on a collection and litigation basis, and what we've shown here is over time, since you can see is 2012, approximately $7.1 million was being recovered from that team. If you go back to 2010, it was approximately $4 million, and you can see last year is $14.3 million. And of note, fiscal year 20, you had a little bit of a dip, and that was because of COVID and some actions we took to assist borrowers during the difficult time when the pandemic started. But at the bottom, you can see the monthly collections, which does include this current fiscal year, and you can see that they've recovered from our lull in fiscal year 20 and began the very good recovery in 2021, and they're on track to exceed fiscal year 21, the year over year in 22. Please. The end of the presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions, but I just wanted to provide a brief overview. And Madam Chair, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. It's a lot of information and kind of some different accounting than what some typical business people might be used to. So are there any questions of the members?
Just real quick, the unappropriated cash is money in our account, but we don't have the authority to use it or allocate it without further appropriation. Is that?
That is exactly correct.
Got it.
It requires legislative action.
Any other questions? Okay, well, hearing none, we will move on to the next item. Thank you, Mr. Martin. Agenda item 7A is discussion of an audit report on the distribution of the National Research University Fund issued in November 2021 by the State Auditor's Office. This item does not require any action. Mr. Robert Paganoff and Mr. Michael Simon from the Texas State Auditor's Office will present this item and be available for questions. I can't see what's going on over here from my vantage point. Okay, there we go.
There is a sign that says to do that. Thank you.
Welcome.
So, again, good afternoon, Madam Chair and members, and again, congratulations with my difficult last name. But my name is Robert Pagenkoff, and I'm a project manager with the State Auditor's Office. With me this afternoon is Mike Simon. He's an audit manager with our office. And we'll be discussing the results of our audit related to the distribution of the National Research University Fund, specifically at the University of Texas at Arlington. As mentioned this morning, the Higher Education Coordinating Board establishes the eligibility criteria for institutions of higher education to receive National Research University funds. Each fiscal year, the Coordinating Board is required to provide certification to the Legislature and the Office of the Comptroller of Public Accounts that has verified information regarding higher education institutions' eligibility. In addition, the information that the higher education institutions report to the Coordinating Board and the Coordinating Board certification are subject to a mandatory audit by the State Auditor's Office. The University of Texas at Arlington was certified by the Coordinating Board in fiscal year 2021 as being eligible to receive National Research University Fund appropriations. In our audit report published in November 2021, we have 2 chapters rated as low, meaning the audit identified strengths in the university and the coordinating board's processes, and the issues identified do not present significant risks. We also have 1 subchapter rated as medium, meaning the issues could moderately affect the university's ability to administer research expenditures. In Chapter 1A of our audit, we discussed that the University of Texas at Arlington met the requirements necessary to be eligible to receive funds from the National Research University Fund. There are 2 mandatory criteria that institutions must meet, including being designated as an emerging research university and expending at least $45 million in restricted research expenditures. Institutions must also meet at least 4 of 6 additional criteria, and the details of those specific requirements are listed in Appendix 4 in our report. For both fiscal year 2019 and 2020, the university was designated as an emerging research institution and expended more than $45 million in restricted research expenditures. It did also meet 4 of the 6 optional criteria, specifically by awarding at least 200 Doctor of Philosophy degrees, having a freshman class of high academic achievement, having a membership with Phi Kappa Phi, and retaining a high-quality faculty. In Chapter 1B, we noted that the university had policies and procedures in place for expending restricted research funds. However, the university recorded items as restricted research expenditures that were not allowed per coordinating board requirements. For fiscal year 2019, we identified $70,807 worth of expenditures in the sample audited that were unallowable. For fiscal year 2020, we identified $20,357 worth of expenditures in the sample audited that were not allowable. In addition, auditors identified that the university should improve its documentation of restricted research awards. In Chapter 2 of our audit report, we noted that the coordinating board had processes for collecting and analyzing information from higher education institutions to determine whether they met the eligibility requirements to receive funds from the National Research University Fund. However, opportunities exist for the coordinating board to strengthen its processes for determining eligibility. In its annual analysis and report on institutional eligibility for NREF funding, the coordinating board should incorporate the most current information that higher education institutions submit to it. This concludes our presentation, but we're happy to answer any questions that you all may have.
Members?
Yeah, thank you. It's Robert Gant. Curious, what are some examples of non-allowable or unallowable expenses that were caught in the
Sure. Typically, some of the things we've seen were meals or other items that would be more of a personal nature and not have a restricted research related basis type item. So again, these are very few items that we identified, but those are pretty good examples as meals, ancillary type services like that.
It's very minor. I was just curious. Thank you.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, UT Arlington has met the 4 of the 6 standards. Is that, I see you're suggesting them strengthen certain areas. So where are they in the process?
They did meet 4 of the 6 criteria, which made them ultimately eligible for NREF funding, and that's what we certified in August.
So what is the next step for them to receive that?
They actually did receive their distribution in August as well, so we worked with the university as well as the comptroller's office to make sure that happened during the fiscal year. But other than that, we did want to thank Mr. Pale and his team, and of course Dr. Cornelius and all of the folks at the coordinating board that made this easier on our side. So again, we appreciate their help.
This is Donna. I have a question for you. I wrote down $70K in unallowables and $20K in unallowables. That's $90,000 in unallowables. That's not $90,000 worth of meals.
That's correct. It's not $90,000 worth of meals. We would certainly be happy to provide you with more information when we get back to our office. We can get that for you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great questions. Any more questions? Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Paganoff and Mr. Simon. We will go ahead and move on to the next item. Agenda item 7B is discussion of approach for obtaining an external quality assurance review of the internal audit and compliance monitoring functions. This item does not require any action. Mr. Mark Pale, Assistant Commissioner, Internal Audit and Compliance, will present this item and be available to answer questions. Mr. Pale.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, Chair and members. My name is Mark Pale, Assistant Commissioner, Internal Audit and Compliance. Excuse me. I wanted to give you and the committee a little background on the requirement once every 3 years that we obtain an external quality assurance review of our internal audit function. We also elect to include our compliance monitoring function in this assessment as well. Our prior assessment was conducted in late fiscal year 2019, so our next assessment will need to be performed late this fiscal year. So this is a team of normally 2 consultants with decades of audit experience that review our compliance with professional standards and provide suggestions on ways that we can improve our operations. They speak with board members, management, and other stakeholders, as well as review our work documentation. This will be the 4th such occasion for me at the coordinating board. Yes, I'm becoming a tenured member of the team if you're doing the math. There's more than one way to obtain an external quality assurance review, with the difference being the level of rigor and independence of the team conducting the review. Here's what I mean by that. At the low end of the spectrum, you can seek volunteer assessors from a local professional association, and in return, I would have to make my time available to serve as a volunteer to reciprocate and serve as an assessor at some future date. At the high end of the spectrum, you can solicit independent external assessors who perform these services for a fee. Past boards have been most comfortable with a high level of rigor, independence, and highly experienced team members executed through a competitive procurement process. We wanted your input and concurrence as we start down the path of working with our procurement team to use the same approach as in the past to obtain a highly experienced and independent individuals to conduct a thorough review of our operations. I'll stop with that and certainly happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Do we have any questions? Okay, no questions. Hearing none, we'll move on to the next item. Agenda item 7C is update on internal audit reports and activities. This item does not require any action. Again, Mr. Mark Pale, Assistant Commissioner of Internal Audit and Compliance, and Mr. Paul Mayer, Assistant Director of Internal Audit and Compliance, will present this item and are available to answer questions. Mr. Pale.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. We completed 1 engagement since our prior meeting in October, and that report is in your materials. It's our department's annual quality assurance report that summarizes various aspects of our internal and ongoing quality assurance work. This report is based on the work we do across our department and is a good segue into providing you with a quick overview of our department and our resources. The chairman and I had previously discussed providing information for our newer board members with some baseline information, and we have a few slides we'd like to walk through with you today in that spirit, and that's what you see before you. Next slide, please. I'm going to start by focusing on our internal audit function, and later during our compliance monitoring update, Mr. Paul Mayer, my associate, will walk the committee through the state and federal compliance monitoring pieces. So what this slide is saying is, from an internal audit standpoint, our professional standards and board approved charter recognize the importance of keeping the board apprised of how much internal auditing is being delivered and whether or not that level of service is meeting your expectations. Next slide, please. Here you see our department structure. I have the privilege of providing the board with a single source of audit and compliance information with 3 distinct but very much related functions: internal audit, compliance monitoring, and federal subrecipient monitoring. As I mentioned, here we'll focus on the internal audit piece, and later Mr. Mayer will touch base on the other 2 areas. Next slide. Our 2 internal auditors are very well credentialed and have decades of audit experience. Together, our team focuses across an agency of now approximately 300 FTEs and a budget close to $1 billion. In order to determine how to focus our limited resources, we divide the agency into 10 organizational units. Those 10 units are then further subdivided across approximately 170 audit areas. For example, our information technology area led by Jinjin Sun is one of the 10 organizational units. And within that, there are 37 audit areas within information technology that we track. So for example, one of those 37 areas within information technology is physical security of technology. So that would be like buildings, restricted rooms, and device protection. Our loan and financial aid program area is another unit, and so forth. Lastly, the slide shows that we have other areas that we use our resources, such as following up on corrective action implementation, conducting investigations, coordinating external audit work, and obtaining an external quality assurance review. Next slide. With 2 dedicated internal auditors and 170 areas plus our other required services, we're currently conducting an average of about 4 to 6 audits per year. But thanks to our coordination of effort with our compliance monitoring teams and our external auditors and other assurance providers, we leverage how many areas are getting audited with those other auditors touching together roughly a quarter of our audit universe. For the remaining areas we're able to get to each year, we do a lot of work to assess risk and direct our internal audit resources to the areas of greatest risk in our agency. The last bullet on this slide gets at the important question of metrics and benchmarking. What do models say about how many internal auditors our agency should have in comparison to other internal audit shops? Those models, unfortunately, show a wide range of benchmarks from 1 to 6 internal auditors, so they're not particularly useful. So I'd like to go to the final slide, please, and we can talk about another way of looking at how many internal auditors may be appropriate for our agency. Risk at the coordinating board, like risk in other organizations, is driven by change. We continue to undergo profound change from external factors, as well as under the leadership of Commissioner Keller. Our organization looks very different than it did a few years ago, and the agency's transformational work, as you heard earlier on the data modernization front and the federal funds front, are examples of large-scale opportunity and risk. We also have the threat of cybersecurity in an agency that houses a vast repository of highly sensitive student information. All of these high-risk areas are presently and will continue to be a part of our internal audit plans. So I'll wrap this up by saying we're committed to continually evaluating these risks and the execution of new programs and important initiatives. I look forward to working with this board and our commissioner to provide assurance and high quality internal audit services. And Madam Chair, I will turn it back to you and happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you, members. Do you have any questions? It's a large task, as you mentioned, a large agency and a lot to make sure it doesn't go wrong. Okay, if there are no questions, let's move on to the next item. Agenda items 8A, numbers 1 through 3, are updates on compliance monitoring reports and activities. These items do not require any action. Mr. Mark Pale, Assistant Commissioner, Internal Audit and Compliance, and Mr. Paul Mayert, Assistant Director of Internal Audit and Compliance, will present this item and are available to answer questions. Mr. Pale and Mr. Mayert.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll defer to my colleague, Mr. Mayert.
Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. My name is Paul Mayert, and I'm Assistant Director of Internal Audit and Compliance. Before we move on to the slides, I just want to do a brief update on state compliance monitoring and federal compliance monitoring. So those would be the 3 areas that we'll be looking at. First, with state compliance monitoring. We completed 3 state compliance monitoring projects since our prior AOC meeting in October, and each of the reports are included in your materials. I'd like to briefly touch on each of these reports. First, the desk review of formula funding at Sul Ross State University. For this project, our initial review and testing indicated that there were potential issues regarding timely tuition payment requirements for formula funding. We asked for and received the assistance of the internal audit department at Sul Ross, and they conducted a substantial review and their report is attached at the end of our report. Ultimately, the review indicated there had been some issues with timely payments in prior semesters, but they were limited and had been corrected before the last semester that was tested. So the last period that we tested showed that the corrective action had been appropriate. Second, the desk review of TEOG, Texas Educational Opportunity Grant at Navarro College. This desk review of TEOG indicated one instance of noncompliance related to student eligibility related to the Texas Controlled Substances Act. The institution has taken appropriate corrective action. And lastly, the desk review of Dallas Baptist University. This report includes one instance, again, of noncompliance regarding an over-award of $1,710 of financial aid funds for the tuition equalization grant. And that institution has also taken corrective action by refunding the amount in question and updating their financial aid procedures. Next, we'll move on to the federal compliance monitoring area, and I'll just give a short update as there as well. First, we continue to complete fiscal year 19 and fiscal year 20 Perkins projects, with 14 of the 15 subrecipient reports issued for FY19 and 12 of the 20 subrecipient reports issued for FY20. None of the reports issued to date include any observations. Second, with regard to FY21 federal GEAR funding, we continue to participate in GEAR meetings and training, as well as discussing subrecipient risk assessments and monitoring plans with GEAR project leaders. In addition, we continue planning subrecipient review work in conjunction with those same GEAR leaders. Lastly, we are also planning a review of subrecipient single audit reports for the entities that passed federal funds, that we passed federal funds through to them in fiscal year 21. Now we'll move on to the slides at hand with regard to resources. Next slide, please. Here you see our department structure again with three distinct but very much related functions: internal audit, compliance monitoring, federal subrecipient monitoring. Mark previously discussed internal audit. Now we'll focus on the other two yellow highlighted areas. First, compliance monitoring, and then federal subrecipient monitoring. Next slide, please. Our 5 state compliance specialists review compliance in 3 statutorily defined areas: data integrity, which is primarily formula funding, state financial assistance funds, and lastly, state required annual reporting and policies related to sexual misconduct related statutes. We also have other areas we use our resources, such as following up on corrective action implementation, providing guidance and input to institutions and coordinating board management, as well as previously discussed assistance with the external quality assurance review. Next slide, please. This slide provides a little more detail on the 3 main areas covered by state compliance monitoring and the expected pace of coverage. For formula funding, we have approximately $2.5 billion per year of funds sent to 103 institutions. The amount per institution varies, with some institutions receiving over 100 million per year and some less than 5 million. We use an annual risk assessment methodology that includes institutions of various sizes so that we get coverage in multiple areas. We cover about 80% of this full population in about 6.9 years at a current pace of 12 reviews per year. For financial assistance, we have approximately $900 million per year of funds sent to 198 institutions. The amount per institution varies, with some institutions receiving over 10 million per year and some less than 100,000. We would cover about 80% of the population in about 13 years at our current pace of 12 reviews per year. Lastly, we also review compliance of institutions for sexual misconduct reporting and policy review. These compliance reviews are part of the basis for required reporting by the coordinating board per the Texas Education Code sections 51258G and 51292F. We would cover about 80% of the population of 217 institutions in about 11.6 years at a pace of 15 reviews per year. Next slide, please. Next, we'll discuss the federal subrecipient monitoring area. our 2 federal compliance specialists support coordinated board program areas by assisting them with subrecipient monitoring requirements for federal funding as required by federal rule under Uniform Grant Guidance Section 2 CFR 200-334. There are 3 main areas of support that are provided: reviewing single audits from each subrecipient, sending management letters to those subrecipients regarding findings from the single audit reports related to those pass-through funds, and lastly, supporting coordinating board program areas with financial desk reviews for a sample of subrecipients as part of their monitoring program of subrecipients. Next slide, please. These next 2 slides are quite detailed, and I don't intend to cover the detail, but I wanted to include the basis in the Uniform Grant Guidance Federal Rule for risk assessments and subrecipient monitoring. The first slide here points to the requirement and purpose of subrecipient risk assessment. As highlighted in red, the risk assessment should evaluate each subrecipient's risk of noncompliance with federal statutes, regulations, and the terms and conditions of the subaward for the purposes of determining the appropriate subrecipient monitoring. Next slide, please. The second slide here points to the requirement of subrecipient monitoring. Federal rule requires that coordinating board monitor the activities of the subrecipient as necessary to ensure that the subaward is used for authorized purposes. Monitoring must include reviewing financial aid and performance reports and ensuring that the subrecipient takes timely and appropriate action on all deficiencies. Next slide, please. Lastly, we will discuss our current and upcoming coverage for federal compliance monitoring. The population of potential coverage is quickly changing in this area, as it is for the coordinating board as a whole. For fiscal year 20, before the influx of GEAR and other federal funding, our primary federal funding was for the Perkins program for approximately $30 million with about 56 subrecipients. For FY21, with the beginning of GEAR funding, expenditures are approximately $150 million in 3 main project areas. For FY22, expenditures are expected to be $100 to $200 million over 20 plus projects. And additional funding for FY23 is expected to be at least an additional $100 million and up to $500 million with the latest round of expected funding. We currently are conducting approximately 20 desk reviews per specialist per year, and we'll risk assess our needs as those amounts change, as well as continue to work with Commissioner Keller and the rest of the staff as far as what the needs need to be. As Mark noted earlier in an internal audit report, we're committed to continually evaluating these risks and the changing risk environment, and look forward to working with the board and our commissioner to provide assurance and high quality services. That concludes my compliance monitoring update. We'll be happy to address any questions you may have.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Committee members, do you have any questions? Okay, hearing none, we will move on to the final agenda item. And that is the conclusion of the Agency Operations Committee meeting. The time is now 1:13 p.m. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So move, Donna.
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
Great. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed to adjourning? All right. Well, the motion passes. Thank you very much for your time today.